The pod hit the trees sideways. It clipped the first one, then the second, and by the third it had lost enough speed that the crash was more of a loud, grinding slide than an explosion. Branches screamed against the hull. Something outside snapped with a sound like a gunshot. Then everything stopped, and the only noise left was the soft hiss of the pod's cooling system and the wind moving through leaves that did not look like any leaves Cadet Rail Dunn had ever seen in his life. He sat there for a moment. He checked his arms. He checked his legs. He pressed 2 fingers to his neck and counted his pulse. It was fast, but it was there, and all things considered, that was a good start. He had been 2 hours into a routine transfer aboard the Ardent Horizon when the navigation system failed. He had heard the alarms before he understood what they meant. He had been reaching for a handhold when the evacuation order came through the speakers, and he had been 3 steps from his assigned pod when the ship listed hard to port and the pod bay doors opened early and the automated system, doing what automated systems do when things go wrong, launched the pod with him half inside it. The rest he knew only from the feeling of it. The drop, the darkness, the long, burning fall through atmosphere. Now he was on a planet that did not have a name on any chart he had ever seen, and the Ardent Horizon was somewhere above the clouds, and his long-range communicator had a crack down the center of its screen that told him everything he needed to know about its current usefulness. He climbed out of the pod. The forest around him was tall. That was the first thing that registered. The trees were not just big. They were enormous. The kind of enormous that made a person feel like a small thing standing at the bottom of a very deep place. Their trunks were wide and dark, with bark that ran in deep ridges and came in colors between dark brown and a muted dark green. The canopy above was so thick that only thin columns of light came through, and the light that did reach the ground was golden and slow-looking, as if it had been filtered through layers of something soft. The air was good. He had checked that first, before climbing out. Oxygen-rich, no particulates his scanner could flag. The temperature was cool, but not cold. Something somewhere was making a low, resonant sound, almost like music, but not quite. Too irregular, too alive. Rail stood at the edge of his crash site and took stock. Survival kit, mostly intact. The food packs were fine. The water filtration tool was fine. The hand tools were fine. The emergency beacon had power, but its range was short enough that it would only reach a ship or shuttle already within close orbital range. He had maybe 30 hours of battery on it before it went dark. Long-range comms, dead. Flares, 4 of them. He put the beacon on low-pulse mode to conserve battery and started moving. He did not know what lived in this forest. He did not know what the nights were like, or how cold they got, or whether the things making sounds in the undergrowth were the size of a rat or the size of a vehicle. What he knew was that the pod had come down in a small clearing made by the crash itself, and that a clearing with a wrecked pod in the center of it was not a place he wanted to sleep in long term. Too exposed. No elevation. No good angles. He scouted a perimeter. He marked the trees that seemed stable. He noted a ridge to the northeast where the ground rose sharply, which gave him options. He was making his 3rd pass along the south edge of the clearing when he heard the sound. It was not a predator sound. He did not know how he knew that. He had no experience with the wildlife of this planet specifically, but there was something about it that read as distress rather than threat. High and irregular. Something caught, not something hunting. He followed it. 15 meters into the trees, he found a patch of vine growth that had come down in a pile, probably pulled loose by a branch that had failed sometime before his arrival. Under the vines, tangled in them at 3 different points, was an animal. It was young. He could tell that from the proportions, the head a little too big for the body, the limbs not quite coordinated with each other. It was also, despite being clearly juvenile, not small. Its body was barrel-shaped and dense, covered entirely in fur that ran in 2 colors, a deep charcoal black across the back and a thick cream white at the chest and belly. The fur was layered. He could see that from a distance, an outer coat of longer hair over something much softer underneath. It had 6 limbs. The back 4 were thick and built for strength. The front 2 were shorter and positioned differently, closer together, almost like arms, with long individual digits at the end. It was using these front limbs now, trying to pull one of the back legs free and not getting anywhere. Along the ridge of its spine, just visible through the thick fur, a line of structures ran from the base of the neck to the tail. They were glowing, a dim, anxious pulse of amber light that shifted faster when the creature struggled and slowed when it stopped to rest. Rail crouched down and looked at it. The creature looked back at him with eyes that were amber to match its spine lights, wide, round, and currently doing a rapid assessment of exactly how much of a threat he was. Its pupils were vertical slits. A second set of eyelids, thin and translucent, slid halfway across from the inner corner of each eye. Rail stayed still. He stayed still for a full 60 seconds. He did not move his hands. He kept his breathing slow and regular. He talked, very quietly, in a low voice. Not words that meant anything, just sound, just the signal that he was not alarmed, that nothing about this situation required speed or aggression. The creature's spine light slowed. Then he started with the vines. It took about 12 minutes. The vines were tough and had twisted in ways that made simple pulling useless. He had to cut some, loosen others, work in a specific order so that freeing one limb did not tighten the tangle on another. He worked from the outermost point inward, narrating what he was doing in that same low, calm voice, and the creature let him. There was one moment when he had to reach directly under its body to free a loop around its lower left leg, when it went very still and the amber lights spiked briefly to something close to red. He slowed down, waited, kept talking, and eventually the lights settled back to amber, and he finished the job. The last vine came loose. The creature did not run. It stood up, shook itself, tested each limb in turn, and then turned around to face Rail, who was still crouched at its level. It was taller than he had expected, standing upright on all four back legs. Its head came up past his shoulder even while he was crouched. Its face was round and wide, with a broad muzzle and a nose that was very slightly too large for it, which gave it an expression of permanent mild surprise. It sniffed him, thoroughly. The wide nose worked its way from his left hand to his right wrist to his shoulder to his face, and the whole time the spine lights ran a slow amber, like something thinking. Then it followed him back to the crash site. It simply walked behind him, not close enough to touch, but close enough that he could hear the soft pad of its paws on the forest floor. When he stopped to check his scanner, it stopped too. When he moved, it moved. He was approximately 30 meters from the pod when it decided that the pod itself required investigation. It walked up to the hull, still warm from the descent, leaned forward, and headbutted it. Solidly. Hard enough that the dent already in the hull shifted shape slightly. The creature stepped back, looked at the hull, looked at Rail. The spine lights pulsed once, slow and deep blue. Satisfied. Brick, Rail said. He did not know why that word came out. It simply did. The creature turned its wide amber eyes on him, ears rotating forward independently of each other, and said nothing, because it was an alien animal and not required to respond to naming ceremonies. Rail checked the pod, recovered what was useful, and began the slow process of thinking through what came next. Brick sat beside the pod and watched him with the focused, serious attention of something that had decided this was its clearing now. Night on DF9 arrived without warning. The light through the canopy went from gold to orange to nothing in about 20 minutes. The sounds in the forest changed. Something far away made a sound that was large and very low, more felt than heard, and Rail was quietly glad to not know what it was. He built a small fire from dead wood near the base of the pod. Brick circled it once, sat down on the far side, and then, apparently deciding that fire was acceptable, curled himself against Rail's left side with the easy confidence of something that had always slept in that spot. The warmth was considerable. The fur was, genuinely, extraordinarily soft. Rail recorded a short personal log on the one working device he had left, speaking quietly into the dark. Day 1. Pod down on DF9, Uncharted. Kit mostly intact. Beacon on low pulse. Range is short. Comms are dead. No rescue contact yet. Plan is to assess shelter options in the morning. The pod clearing is not a good long-term position. He paused. I also appear to have acquired a companion. 6 limbs. Approximately the size of a large dog, though with considerably more structural mass. Charcoal and cream fur with bioluminescent spinal structures that seem to correspond to emotional state. Currently displaying a deep, steady blue. Another pause. I am choosing to interpret that as calm. He looked down. Brick's wide, round head was resting on Rail's leg. The spine lights ran slow and blue, and even in the dark, like a small line of stars. Outside the circle of firelight, the forest made its sounds. Rail was not afraid. He was, if he was honest about it, curious about the trees, about the sounds, about the creature whose warmth pressed steady and solid against his ribs. There was a problem here to be solved, and problems to be solved were things he understood. He closed his log, settled back against the pod hull, and let himself sleep. Brick did not move. The problem with the crash site was simple. Everything could see it. Rail had figured this out on the first morning, when he climbed to the top of the pod's exterior, which sat at a slight angle against a fallen tree, giving him about 3 meters of height, and looked around. The pod had cleared a rough oval in the canopy when it came down. Light came through that gap in a wide column, which meant the clearing was visible from above and, more importantly, from the sides. The treeline around it was open enough that anything moving through the forest could walk into the clearing with almost no warning. He had heard things moving in the dark the previous night. He had not gone to look, which was the correct decision. But he had listened, and what he heard told him that the ground level of this forest was, after dark, a busy place. He needed height. He stood on top of the pod, drank from his water filtration bottle, and looked at the trees. There was one, to the northeast, maybe 40 meters away, that was clearly the largest specimen in the immediate area. Its trunk was wide enough that he could not have reached around it with both arms, probably not even close. It grew straight for about 20 meters before the first branches appeared, and those branches were enormous, the kind that were themselves the size of small trees, growing outward in 3 directions and forming, where they met the trunk, a natural platform that was wide and mostly flat, and entirely above the reach of whatever had been moving around in the dark last night. 60 meters up, roughly. Maybe more. Rail looked at it for a long time. Then he went back to the pod, pulled out the salvage cable, checked his hand tools, and started thinking about how to get up there. Brick watched him from a comfortable position at the base of the pod, which the cub had apparently decided was a suitable throne. His front limbs were folded under his chest. His wide amber eyes tracked Rail's movements with the attentiveness of something deciding whether to participate or simply observe. The first problem was getting the initial line up. Rail had no good anchor points at height, which meant he needed to create one. He spent the first hour fashioning a weighted throw line from salvaged wire and a piece of hull plating, and then he spent another 40 minutes throwing it at a specific branch junction until the line draped the way he needed it to. Brick watched this entire process with his head tilted. His ears rotated forward every time Rail's throw went wrong, which was most of the time, and settled back to neutral when the line fell short again. When the line finally caught and held, Rail pulled it tight, tied off the end, and turned around. Brick was sitting directly behind him, holding a section of spare cable in his front limbs. Rail looked at the cable, looked at Brick. Brick placed the cable on the ground in front of Rail's feet. His spine lights pulsed once, a warm, satisfied amber. "Thank you," Rail said, because it seemed like the appropriate response. That was how the construction partnership began. Brick's front limbs, Rail had already noticed, were more dexterous than they looked. The digits were long and curved slightly inward, which made them excellent for gripping, not with the precision of human hands, but with a firm, consistent hold that was better suited to carrying than to fine work. What this meant, practically, was that Brick could carry things. Significant things. He could grip a bundle of salvage cable in both front limbs and carry it across uneven ground without losing it, which was more than some of the Cadet transport systems Rail had worked with could manage. He also had opinions about structural stability. This became apparent early. Rail had pulled together a set of branch sections from the forest floor to use as cross supports on the platform, and he had sorted them by size and set them in a row. Brick walked along the row, and at one point he stopped, sat on a particular branch section, applied what appeared to be his full weight, and remained there until the section cracked and split down the middle. He then stepped off it, sniffed it once, and moved on. Rail removed that branch from the pile. He went through the pile a second time, watching. Every section Brick had stopped on went into a discard pile. Everything else stayed. At the end of the process, Rail had a smaller pile of materials, but every piece in it was structurally sound, and he had not needed to test a single one himself. He made a note in his log that evening: structural pre-screening via Brick. Method is unconventional. Results are reliable. By the end of the first day, the platform base was in place. It was rough. The boards were not uniform, and the gaps between them were wider than he would have preferred. The support points where the platform rested on the branch junction were solid, but the whole thing had a slight list to the north side that he needed to correct. But it was up there, and it held his weight, and the view from it was something he had not quite expected. From 60 meters up, the forest was different. The noise was different. Higher, lighter, the sounds of things that lived in the canopy rather than on the ground. The light was different too, more open, less filtered. He could see the shape of the land beneath the trees, a ridge to the east, a low area to the south that might be water. In the far distance, past the canopy edge, he could see the line where the trees stopped and something else began, though he was too far away to tell what. He could also see, through a gap in the canopy to the west, a stretch of empty sky that would be visible from above. That was useful. That was very useful. He climbed back down. Brick was at the base of the tree, examining the rope with deep suspicion. The rope had passed through his front limb investigation without incident, which Rail counted as an endorsement. The second day was the detail work. He added the sleeping area, a level section at the rear of the platform, bordered on three sides by branches he lashed into position with cable to prevent rolling off in the night. He built a small shelf system against the trunk for kit storage. He set up the rainwater collection, a section of pod hull plating, angled at 7 degrees, running from a high point to a collection vessel at the platform edge. 7 degrees was the right angle. 5 degrees was not enough to overcome surface tension in the conditions on this planet, and he had arrived at this through testing and not through guessing, which was a distinction he cared about. The pulley was the most time-consuming part. He needed a way to move gear up and down without climbing with it, because climbing with a loaded pack on a single rope at 60 meters was the kind of decision that ended careers and lives with roughly equal frequency. A simple counterweight pulley was the answer. Cable over a high branch, load on one end, counterweight on the other, balanced so that a modest input of force moved the load smoothly. The counterweights were where things went sideways. He had shaped 4 small weights from pieces of hull plating, heavy and uniform, and had set them on the ground below while he ran the cable. Brick, apparently deciding that small, uniform, heavy objects were interesting, ate 2 of them before Rail noticed what was happening. Not damaged. Not thrown. Ate. Swallowed. Gone. Rail stood there for a moment. Brick's spine lights were a warm, unconcerned amber. He was chewing something. Those were counterweights, Rail said. Brick finished chewing. Rail picked up the remaining 2 weights, considered the problem for a moment, and then went into the forest and found 4 rocks of roughly equivalent mass. He used rocks for the counterweights. The rocks were not as precisely shaped as the hull plating pieces, but rocks were not edible, or at least Brick showed no interest in them, and the pulley worked correctly, and that was the end of that. He tested the system 3 times before he was satisfied. By the second afternoon, the platform was complete. It had a sleeping section with walls on 3 sides, a storage shelf, a functional pulley system, and a rainwater collector that was already gathering from the light drizzle that had started midway through the day. The whole thing sat in the branch junction of the biggest tree Rail had ever personally climbed, 60 meters above anything that had been making sounds in the dark, and it was not beautiful, but it was solid, and it was his. He sat at the edge of the platform and let his legs hang and looked out at the forest. Brick had climbed the tree. This had surprised Rail. Not that Brick wanted to come up, but that he managed it. The cub had watched Rail climb for 2 days, and at some point on the second afternoon, he had simply started climbing himself, using his back 4 legs for grip and his front 2 for reaching. He was slower than Rail on the rope, and he took a more direct route up the trunk, working his claws into the bark ridges, but he arrived at the platform with the expression of something that had done nothing remarkable and sat down in the sleeping section immediately. The sleeping section now contained Brick. There was not much room left. Rail moved his pack to the shelf and did not argue about it. From somewhere above the clouds, far enough up that nothing on the surface would see it, the ardent horizon was still there. Captain Orva again had not left. She had tried every channel Rail's kit could receive, and he had received only static, but she had not left, and she would not leave, because Orva again did not leave people, and every hour she argued with Fleet Command about the authorization required to enter the atmosphere of an uncharted planet was an hour she was still up there trying. Rail did not know this, but he had guessed it. He knew Orva. He turned on the beacon, still on low pulse, and checked the charge. Enough for another day, maybe more if he was careful. He was being careful. He was also looking at the gap in the canopy to the west, the clear line of sky that an approaching shuttle would pass through on a descent from orbit, and doing the math on angles and distances and signal range. And the math was coming out in a direction he found encouraging. His short-range beacon chirped once. He grabbed the scanner so fast he nearly knocked it off the platform shelf. He steadied it with both hands and looked at the reading. Upper atmosphere. Orbital range, coming in. Not fixed. Moving. Descending. The signature of a ship making a controlled atmospheric entry. Rail looked at the reading for 3 full seconds. Then he smiled. It was a small smile, the kind that happened before a person had time to stop it, and it sat on his face while he calculated signal timing and prepared his transmitter kit and thought about what, exactly, he wanted to say when the connection came through. Brick opened one eye from the sleeping section. The spine lights ran slow and calm and blue. "We've got company coming," Rail told him. Brick closed his eye. The drizzle had stopped. The canopy dripped softly. The western gap in the trees showed a darkening sky, and somewhere in that sky, something was coming down. Rail began composing his first proper transmission. The rescue shuttle Kelver 7 had been in the upper atmosphere of DF9 for 11 minutes before they got anything back from the surface. Lieutenant Dova Shun had expected silence. The planet had no records, no prior survey, no beacon infrastructure. The missing cadets' long-range comms were flagged as non-functional in the pod's last automated telemetry burst, which had been the only signal from that pod since it left the Arden Horizons Bay 47 hours ago. The short-range beacon they had picked up on approach was weak and intermittent, the kind of signal that comes from a kit running low on power. What she had expected, when contact finally came through, was a voice, probably strained, possibly injured, asking for coordinates, asking for extraction time, asking whether anyone had thought to bring medical supplies. What she got was a video transmission. Dova stared at her screen for a half-second of pure confusion, then accepted it. The image that came through was slightly compressed by the transmission distance, but clear enough. It showed a wooden platform, rough, built from mismatched materials, sitting in the fork of an enormous tree. The light coming through the canopy around it was warm and late afternoon gold. There were storage items organized along one side. A length of cable ran up and over a branch above the frame. A human came into shot. He was young, 19, she knew from the file, though he looked it, with short dark hair and an expression of calm, focused concentration. He was holding the transmission device out in front of him, aimed slightly upward to capture the space around him, and he moved with the easy familiarity of someone walking through a place he knew well. Kelver 7. This is Cadet Rail Dunn, confirming reception of your approach signal. I'm transmitting from my current position. He turned the camera to show the forest below, a long, long drop through green shadow to a forest floor that was barely visible. 60 meters up, roughly. I'll give you a quick tour so you understand the layout before we talk about extraction. Navigator Pell, who had been doing deep space work for 31 years and had personally overseen 14 survival rescues, said nothing. He simply leaned slightly closer to his screen. Rail walked the camera to the left side of the platform. This is the materials shelf. Kit is organized by priority, medical and comms at the top, food and tools below. Everything is dry. I ran a waterproofing layer using the pod's insulation strips after the first night, so the drizzle we had yesterday didn't cause any issues. He moved to the center of the platform. Rainwater collection is here, hull plating from the pod, angled at 7 degrees, running into this vessel. Output is about 0.4 liters per hour in normal precipitation. I tested 5 degrees first, but the surface tension on this planet is slightly higher than standard due to the atmospheric composition, so 7 works better. He crouched down and showed the pulley mechanism attached to the branch above, a neat, functional system with a counterweight made from smooth stones. Pulley for gear movement. Counterweight is set to roughly 80% of my loaded pack weight, so a small input of force moves the full load. I originally made the counterweights from hull plating. A brief pause. Those are gone now. The rocks work fine. Dova muted her audio channel. She did this because she had just made a sound that was not appropriate for a professional communication channel. It was a short sound, involuntary, somewhere between a laugh and the noise a person makes when they are not sure whether something is funny or deeply impressive, and she did not want it going into the recorded transmission log. She unmuted. Rail had moved to the rear of the platform. Sleeping area is here. 3-sided, good wind protection. The floor is double-layered. I added the second layer on the second day after I realized the gap spacing in the first layer was going to be uncomfortable over multiple nights. It's not perfect, but it's... He stopped. The camera shifted. A large, round head appeared in the frame. The head belonged to something covered in dense, two-toned fur. Deep charcoal across the top, cream white at the face and chest, and it was large. Even in the compressed transmission video, the scale was clear. The creature's face was wide and soft-looking, with amber eyes that were currently fixed on the transmission device with an expression of total, focused interest. Along the back of its neck, just visible above the sleeping section wall, a line of structures glowed a warm gold. It raised one large, dexterous front paw and placed it on the transmission device. "Brick," Rail said, without looking at him. "Don't." The paw stayed where it was. "Brick." The paw was removed. Very slowly. The creature made a low sound that vibrated at a frequency Pell could feel in his sternum even through the transmission speakers. Its spine lights shifted to amber. "That's Brick," Rail said to the camera. "He's been here since the first day. I found him caught in vine growth near the pod landing site. He follows me around the platform and functions as a structural pre-screener. He sits on any new material I'm considering using, and if it fails under his weight, I discard it. He's approximately the size of a large dog in body volume, but considerably denser. Diet seems to be primarily fruit and slow-moving insects, with a noted interest in metal counterweights." A pause. "I am monitoring that situation." On the bridge of the Kelver 7, nobody spoke. Pell had not moved. He was a compact, gray-scaled alien with very still eyes, and at this moment those eyes were fixed on the screen with an expression that could generously be described as careful professional assessment and more accurately described as complete bewilderment held very tightly together. Dova had muted herself again. She was not succeeding at controlling her face. The medic, Oru, was holding her scanner at her side and had stopped moving entirely. On screen, Rail had finished the sleeping area segment. He walked back to the center of the platform and faced the camera properly. Structural summary. The platform is solid. I've tested every load point and the main branch junction hasn't shifted in 2 days under combined weight. That's me, the kit, and Brick, who I estimate is around 40 kilograms. The tree itself shows no signs of stress. He glanced upward briefly. I've identified one weak point on the north side lashing that I'll reinforce before departure, but it's not critical. He turned the camera. The western gap in the canopy filled the frame, an opening in the green ceiling that showed a wide rectangle of evening sky, blue going orange at the far edge. The forest spread below it in layers, the upper canopy golden in the late light. It was, Dova registered despite herself, genuinely beautiful. Landing zone information. Rail's voice stayed the same, calm, clear, practical. Best clearing is 200 meters south-southwest of my position. I've marked the coordinates in this transmission's data header. The clearing is approximately 30 meters wide at its broadest point, should be adequate for a standard shuttle. One note, there is an active predator den approximately 40 meters east of that clearing. I don't know the species, haven't seen the adult, but the den is large and the occupant or occupants are vocal after dark. I recommend a north approach vector to avoid that area. Approach from south would bring you over the den on your descent path. He turned the camera back to himself. Kit status is good. I have food for another 4 days and water collection is keeping pace with consumption. No injuries. Slightly sunburned on the left forearm. I'll sort that out. A brief, matter-of-fact expression. I've put the pulley and most of the platform materials on the salvage list. Some of it is pod components that should go back to the Ardent Horizons maintenance log. He paused. Rail done, Cadet. Awaiting your response. The transmission ended. The bridge of the Kelver 7 was quiet for a long moment. Outside the viewports, DF9's upper atmosphere drifted in slow green-gray layers. The planet had no name and no record and no reason to be anything other than an obstacle. And somewhere beneath those clouds, a 19-year-old human had spent 2 days building a functional elevated shelter with a working water system and a pulley. Befriended, what scans of the transmission image suggested was a juvenile specimen of a previously undocumented apex predator species, and had just sent a detailed facility tour as his first act of contact with his rescue team. Pell looked at his screen. He built a pulley system, Pell said. With stone counterweights, Dova said. Because the originals were eaten. He said he was monitoring the situation. He has a rainwater angle calculation. 7 degrees. Because 5 wasn't enough. Another pause. He named it Brick, Pell said. He named the juvenile apex predator Brick, Dova confirmed. Which is currently sleeping in the sleeping section that the Cadet built. Yes. Of the elevated shelter. Yes. Pell looked at his navigation display. He looked at the coordinates in the transmission header. He looked at the recommended approach vector, which had been calculated with precision and included a specific note about the predator den and its eastern position relative to the landing zone. Then he looked back at his screen, where the now dark transmission window showed the last frame of DF9's canopy at sunset, golden and vast and quietly extraordinary. He opened the channel to the surface. Cadet done. This is Navigator Pell aboard Kelver 7. Transmission received. A short pause in which he appeared to be composing himself. We are beginning descent. Approach from north as recommended. Estimated surface contact in 32 minutes. He closed the channel. Request landing clearance from the ardent horizon, he said to Dova. Already submitted, she said. Below them, on a platform in the highest fork of the biggest tree in the forest, Rail Dunn set down his transmission device and started on the north side lashing he had flagged as a weak point. Brick watched him work with the focused, amber-eyed attention of something that understood that the arrival of new individuals required a structure to be in good order. The spine lights ran slow and blue. The shuttle began its descent. The Kelver 7 came down through the canopy gap at a shallow angle, rotors cycling to low for the final approach, and settled into the clearing with the soft thud of a craft that had done this 1,000 times. Dust rose from the forest floor and then fell again. Somewhere to the east, something in the tree-line made a single deep, resonant sound and went quiet. Dova Shun was first out, which was protocol. She stepped onto the forest floor with her scanner in her right hand and her sidearm unholstered but pointed down, and she swept the clearing in a practiced half-circle before she brought her eyes to the tree line. She found Rail immediately. He was standing at the southern edge of the clearing, pack on his back, kit organized and loaded, hands loose at his sides. He was watching her approach with the calm attention of someone who had been waiting for a while and was not particularly bothered by the wait. His left forearm was slightly reddened from sun exposure, but otherwise he looked unremarkable. A young human in a cadet's field uniform, somewhat dusty, standing in an alien forest as if he had simply stepped out of an ordinary training exercise. Behind him, almost exactly at shoulder height, was Brick. Dova stopped walking. She had seen the transmission. She had watched the tour. She had, she believed, prepared herself for the reality of the creature. She had been wrong about that. In the video, Brick had been framed against platform wood and shadowed canopy, which had reduced his apparent size. In person, standing at the edge of the forest in the late afternoon light, he was considerably more present. His chest was wide. His head was round and enormous and covered in dense fur that caught the light and did something iridescent at the edges, a shift of blue, black, and green that moved when he moved. His spine lights, currently running at a slow gold, were brighter than the transmission had suggested. His front paws, the dexterous pair, were folded at his chest, giving him a posture that was almost composed. His amber eyes were on Dova with the flat, complete attention of something that was deciding what she was. She held still. Rail looked at her. Kelver 7 crew. Dova Shun, Lieutenant. Good to see you, Cadet. Likewise. He tilted his head slightly toward Brick without looking at him. That's Brick. He'll want to come and sniff you in a minute. I'd recommend letting him. Letting him. The alternative is he does it anyway, but with less warning. The sniff itself is just information gathering. He uses the front limbs to steady himself while he leans in. That part can be startling if you're not expecting it, because his front paws come up to about your shoulders. Just don't step back fast. Dova considered this advice. She was armed. Her scanner was reading a mass signature from Brick that it was currently refusing to categorize because nothing in its database matched the profile. The creature's spine lights had shifted from gold to a slow, considering amber while she stood there. "Understood," she said, which was not the same as comfortable, but was the best she could do. The rest of the crew came down the shuttle ramp. Medic Oru went directly to Rail with her scanner already running, the way medics do when they have prepared for a crisis and are going to find one whether the situation cooperates or not. She ran the beam from his head to his feet, checked the reading, ran it again. Rail waited. Oru looked at her screen. She looked at Rail. Her expression was one that medics develop over many years of rescue work, and that roughly translated to, "I prepared 3 coagulants and a neural stabilizer for this. Mild dehydration," she said. "I know. The collection rate on the rainwater system couldn't quite keep pace with output in the warmer part of the day. I was managing it. 2 lacerations on the right hand. First day? They're clean. I used the antiseptic from the kit." "They are clean," Oru agreed, in the tone of someone who finds this faintly offensive. Brick, who had been watching the medic's scanner with deep suspicion from the moment she raised it, rose from his sitting position and walked toward her. He did not do it fast or threateningly. He covered the ground between them with the patient, deliberate movement of something that has a specific goal and is not in a hurry about it. Oru went very still. Brick brought his front paws up to her shoulders, the digits pressing lightly for balance, leaned forward, and applied the full investigative power of his nose to her equipment bag. His spine lights ran amber, curious, and even. "He smells the antiseptic," Rail said. "He watched me use it. I think he associates the smell with useful things. He won't damage the bag. His grip control is actually quite precise." Oru, who had extensive field experience with alien wildlife and had handled some genuinely dangerous situations with calm professionalism, was doing her best to embody that history right now. She was largely succeeding, except for her hands, which were very still in the deliberate way that hands are still when they want very much to move. Brick finished his inspection. He stepped back, sat down, and sneezed, a short, powerful sound that scattered a small amount of leaf debris from the ground around him. His spine lights went back to gold. Pell had come down the ramp last. He stood at the base of it and looked at the clearing, the cadet, and the creature. He was a thorough and methodical person by nature, and he was working through what he was seeing in a thorough and methodical way, which was taking somewhat longer than usual. He walked to Rail. He was not tall, and Rail was, which required a slight upward adjustment that Pell made without comment. "The north side lashing you mentioned in the transmission," Pell said. "Did you reinforce it before we arrived?" "Yes, between the transmission and the landing." "Good." Pell nodded once. He appeared to have questions that were not about the lashing, but he was approaching them in order. "The Predator Den, you marked it as 40 meters east. Have you observed the adult at any point?" "No. I've heard it. It's large, based on the vocalization. I gave it a wide margin." "Sensible." Pell looked at Brick. Brick looked at Pell. "And the Brick," Rail supplied. "Yes. The creature. It has been with you since day 1. Since the evening of day 1. I found him caught in vine growth about 15 meters into the forest east of the pod site. Freed him, brought him back. He didn't leave." Pell considered this. "You approached a creature of unknown species, in an unknown environment, on an uncharted planet, alone." "He was stuck," Rail said. There was a pause that contained several things Pell did not say. The shuttle ramp closed behind them as the crew began the process of loading Rail's gear. He had organized it for exactly this. Everything in the order it needed to be loaded, the pod salvage items tagged separately from his personal kit. Dova ran the loading while Oru completed her medical check, and Pell continued his quiet inventory of the situation around him with the expression of a person writing a report in their head. Captain Orva again came down the ramp last. She was not a tall person, but she occupied space in a way that made the question of height irrelevant. She had commanded the Arden Horizon for 6 years, and had spent 2 of those 6 years arguing with fleet administration about protocols she considered insufficient, a record she was about to extend by at least 1 more incident. She had also spent the last 47 hours doing everything within and several things outside her authority to get a shuttle down to this planet, and she was currently holding all of that in a very contained and professional manner. She looked at the forest. She looked at the cleared platform area visible in the canopy above. She looked at the organized gear being loaded. She looked at Brick, who was sitting near the shuttle ramp and watching the loading process with his head tilted and his ears tracking each crew member independently. Then she looked at Rail. "Report," she said. "Kit intact except long-range comms. Beacon battery at 12%. I was conservative with it. Pod is a write-off, but I've tagged the salvageable components. Platform is structurally sound if anyone wants to note it for the survey file. It's a good anchor point for the area." Orva nodded. She was quiet for a moment. Then, "Were you afraid?" Rail thought about it. He did not answer immediately, which she appreciated. She disliked immediate answers to questions like that, because they were usually the answer the person thought they were supposed to give rather than the real one. "First night," he said finally, "before I found Brick. The sounds in the dark I didn't know what they were or how big they were or how interested they were in me. That was uncomfortable." A pause. After that it was more like a problem. And problems are easier. Orva looked at him for a moment. She had known cadets who had lost composure in far less isolated situations. She had known officers who had. "Get on the shuttle, Cadet." "Yes, Captain." He turned toward the ramp. And then he stopped, because Brick had risen and was walking toward the shuttle door, and he sat down at the base of the ramp with his wide body blocking the lower step and his amber eyes on Rail and his spine lights at a very still, very steady deep blue. Rail set his pack down. He crouched in front of Brick, which put them at roughly the same eye level, and he talked to him. Quietly, with his voice low, the way he had talked on the first day in the vines. The crew loaded the last of the gear without speaking. Orville watched from near the shuttle door and did not hurry anyone. The conversation lasted about 2 minutes. Nobody on the crew could hear what Rail said. They could see that he kept his hands relaxed. They could see Brick's spine lights cycle through amber and back to blue, slow and irregular, and then settle. They could see the moment when Brick brought both front paws up to Rail's shoulders and pressed his enormous, round forehead against Rail's with a gentleness that was startling in something that had headbutt the metal hull hard enough to change its shape. The spine lights ran one long, slow pulse, deep blue, almost violet, and then went dim and steady. Brick put his paws down. He turned around. He walked back into the forest at the unhurried pace of something that has made a decision and is not going to reconsider it. He did not look back. Rail stayed crouched for a moment. Then he stood up, picked up his pack, and came up the ramp. The ramp closed. The shuttle lifted. Rail was sitting at the rear-facing viewport, pack between his feet, and he watched the clearing get smaller below them. The circular gap in the canopy, the ring of enormous trees, the late afternoon light going gold across the upper branches. He watched until the cloud layers swallowed the view and there was nothing left to see. He did not say anything. Nobody asked him to. Pell was already at the navigation console, entering the departure sequence. Dova was logging the recovery details. Oru was writing a medical report that was going to be the shortest one she had produced in her career. After a while, Rail took out his kit log and began updating it, because the pod salvage components needed to be formally recorded before they reached the ardent horizon, and the sooner that was done the cleaner the handover would be. The forest fell away below the clouds. Somewhere in it, in a platform in the highest fork of the biggest tree, the rainwater collector was still running at 7 degrees. And somewhere in the dark of the canopy, a line of spine lights glowed dim and blue and quiet, and did not go out. Fleet Station Cairo was not a place that dealt in unusual things. It was a transit and logistics hub, fuel, resupply, crew rotations, maintenance. It processed 240 ships per week on average and handled approximately 9,000 individual personnel movements per month. Its corridors were busy at all hours. Its mess halls served 19 species. Its administrative division had more filing systems than most planetary governments, and it processed incident reports with the patient, grinding efficiency of machinery that had been doing the same thing for a very long time. It had never processed an incident report quite like this one. Rail's debriefing began at 0900 on the day after his return, in a small room in the administrative wing with 3 officers and a recording system. Standard recovery debrief. Estimated duration, 90 minutes. It ran for 4 hours and 20 minutes. The length was not because anything went wrong. It was because every officer in the room had read the incident file, and every one of them, at different points and for different reasons, arrived at questions they felt they needed answered that were not technically on the debriefing form. The navigation failure was covered in the first 20 minutes. The emergency launch, the descent, the landing, another 15. Then one of the officers, a senior analyst named Brack with careful eyes and a habit of writing things down even when the room was being recorded, asked about the shelter decision, and the debrief took a different direction and did not come back. The record shows you began construction within the first 6 hours of landing, Brack said. Closer to the first 4, Rail said. Before you attempted extended beacon transmission. The beacon battery was limited. Transmitting blindly into empty space with no target in range is a fast way to run it flat. I needed to survive comfortably first and signal when someone was within actual reception distance. Those are 2 separate tasks, and they needed to happen in that order. Brack wrote something down. The elevated structure, the second officer said. Her name was Seal. She was from Orva's command staff and had the expression of someone who had been thinking about this since the transmission came in. 60 meters. The branch junction was at approximately 60 meters, yes. You chose that height intentionally. The ground level of that forest is actively used by predators after dark. I heard them on the first night. 60 meters puts the platform above the effective range of anything I observed or heard during my time there. It also gave me a sight line to the western canopy gap, which I had identified as the optimal approach vector for a shuttle on descent. A pause. Those were both intentional. Seal looked at her file. The rainwater collection system. 7 degrees. 5 wasn't enough. You tested this. I had the materials and the time. Testing is faster than guessing. There was a short silence. The third officer, a logistics specialist who had said very little so far, looked up from his screen. The counterweights, he said. The rocks worked fine. I'm not questioning the rocks. I'm asking about the original counterweights. Hull plating from the pod. Shaped and weighted. 2 of them were eaten by brick before I noticed what was happening. The logistics officer looked at his screen. He appeared to be deciding whether to make a notation. He made the notation. Noted. The debrief ended at 13:20. Rail was given a meal voucher and told to remain available. By 1400, the transmission video had been formally logged, tagged as case evidence, and access had been restricted to authorized personnel. By 1600, it had been seen by approximately half the personnel on Fleet Station Caro. Nobody could explain exactly how this happened. The official records showed that the transmission was restricted. The unofficial reality was that restricted files on shared administrative systems have a way of becoming known, especially when the people processing them find them interesting, which the people processing this one unanimously did. Someone had mentioned it to someone else. Someone else had found a way to pull the file header data. By the time a formal circulation advisory was issued, the thing had already circulated. A human cadet. Uncharted planet. 47 hours. Treehouse. Beast cub. Counterweights were eaten. The story moved through the station the way things move when they are both funny and impressive, which is to say rapidly and without stopping. Dova Shin became, briefly, very popular in the officers section because she was one of 4 people who had been present at the actual landing, and people wanted details. She gave a professional account to the 3 who asked first and then stopped answering questions about it, which made her more popular, which she had not anticipated. Pell, when asked, said, the cadet had good situational awareness and took appropriate action. This was technically everything that needed to be said and also entirely failed to convey what it had actually been like to receive that transmission, which was why people kept asking Dova. Medic Oru's report, shortest of her career, as predicted, became something of an informal curiosity. It was 3 sentences. It said the recovered personnel was in good health with no significant injuries and had clearly managed his kit resources effectively. It did not say that she had arrived with 3 types of coagulant and a neural stabilizer, because that was not relevant to the outcome, but several people who knew Ora knew it anyway. Rail, for his part, spent 2 days in the temporary quarters assigned to him, completed the salvage forms for the pod components, ate regular meals, and appeared to have no particular feelings about the attention his incident had generated. When people spoke to him about it, he was polite and gave accurate information when asked. He did not seek out conversation on the subject. He was called in to see Admiral Breck Udo on the 3rd day. Breck Udo was a large, careful person. He had commanded fleets. He had managed crises that involved multiple systems and thousands of personnel and consequences that could not be fully undone. He had seen courage of many kinds, from many species, and he had learned to recognize it in its different forms, which were not always the form people expected. He had read the incident file 3 times. Rail stood in front of his desk and waited. At what point, Breck said, did you make the decision to build the shelter before attempting extended beacon transmission? Within the first 2 hours of landing, Rail said. Once I had assessed the kit status and determined that the beacon battery wouldn't sustain a long-range transmission attempt. You had 4 flares. Yes, for visual signaling. But a flare is single-use and short duration. It's useful if there's already a ship within visual range. There wasn't, so I saved them. And the shelter took 2 days. The platform took 2 days. The initial safe sleeping position, up the tree with a rope, took about 3 hours. Breck looked at him. You rationed your distress signal, he said, so that you could build furniture. I would describe it as a utility platform, sir. It had a sleeping section. It did. And a pulley. For load movement, yes. Breck was quiet for a moment. He was a person who had heard many things in many rooms, and he was doing the particular work of processing something that sat outside his existing categories. Not because it was impossible. Everything that had happened was entirely practical and logical and correctly sequenced. It was simply that the logic, while correct, was not the logic of someone in crisis. It was the logic of someone managing a project. A 19-year-old human had been alone on an uncharted planet and had managed it like a project. The creature, Breck said. Brick. Yes. You approached it alone. He was stuck. Another pause. Breck recognized this answer. He had heard a version of it in the debrief recording, and it had struck him then the same way it struck him now, not as recklessness, but as a very simple moral accounting that had not left room for any other decision. Captain Ginn has submitted a commendation request, Breck said. The language is still being worked out. I understand. There are also questions about the navigation system failure. That will be a separate process. Also understood. Breck looked at the file on his desk. He closed it. Is there anything you need from the station before you're reassigned to the Arden Horizon? Rail thought for a moment. There was a xenobiology request in the incident file about brick species. I wanted to add some behavioral notes from my time on DF9, if the file can accept supplementary observation logs. Breck looked at him. I kept a personal log, Rail said. Some of the detail might be useful. The front limb dexterity in particular. I don't think it came through fully in the transmission footage. Breck said, I'll make sure the file can receive it. Thank you, sir. Outside the Admiral's office, in the corridors and mess halls of Fleet Station Cairo, the story was still moving. It had taken on a shape by now, the shape things take when they are told and retold, simplified at the edges, the key details becoming clearer as the unnecessary ones fell away. The main elements remained. The platform, the pulley, the counterweights, Brick. The non-human crew of the station had their own version of the conversation that humans tended not to hear. It happened in quieter spaces, in languages that did not carry, in the careful, measured way that different species discussed things they found genuinely hard to understand. It was not the danger that had impressed them. It was not the survival, exactly, because survival was a basic outcome and most species had mechanisms for it. It was the 2 days of construction on a planet he had never seen, the 7-degree angle, the stone counterweights, the structural pre-screening by a juvenile predator whose presence he had interpreted as useful rather than threatening. It was the pulley. It was the note in the log. I was scared the first night. After that it was more like a problem. Humans met disaster and immediately began organizing it. This was known. It had always been known, and it was always slightly unsettling, and it was the kind of thing that was very hard to explain to someone who did not share the instinct. The appropriate response to being stranded and alone was distress. It was not. I should reinforce the north side lashing before they arrive. Dovashin found Rail in the mess hall that evening, eating at a corner table with his kit log open beside his tray. She sat across from him. She had thought about how to begin this conversation and had not found a good way, so she started with the things she actually wanted to know. First night, she said. Alone. Up in the tree before Brick came up. What were you actually thinking about? Rail considered this. He was not a person who answered quickly when a slow answer was more accurate. The counterweight ratio, he said. I had the pulley design mostly figured out, but I hadn't worked out the correct counterweight mass yet. I kept running the numbers, and something wasn't matching up. I figured out later that I was using standard gravity for the math, and DF9 runs slightly lower, so the numbers were off. Dova looked at him. I didn't figure that part out until the morning, he said, and finished his food. Dova sat with this for a moment. Then she picked up her own tray and started eating, because there was not really anything to add to that. 3 months is a short time in the life of a space station. It is a longer time in the life of a forest. The survey authorization for DF9 came through 6 weeks after Rail's recovery. It took that long because an uncharted oxygen-rich biome required classification before any formal mission could be mounted, and classification required preliminary atmospheric and surface data, and preliminary data required a probe run, and the probe run had to be approved by a different department than the one that had to approve the survey mission itself. And these two departments had a standing disagreement about sequencing requirements that added another 10 days. By the time the authorization was finalized, the Xenobiology Division had submitted 9 separate requests for biological specimens from DF9's surface, and the preliminary probe data had flagged 17 separate categories of scientific interest. The survey team was 8 people. Dr. Vaughn was one of them, a xenobiologist, Torati, narrow and fast-moving, with 4 upper limbs that she used with the constant multitasking energy of someone who had always found 2 arms insufficient. She had been the first in her department to see Rail's behavioral observation logs, and she had submitted her assignment request within 4 minutes of reading them. Rail's assignment request had gone through Orva, who had approved it without saying anything about it, which was how Orva handled decisions she had made before the request arrived. They landed at the clearing on a clear morning. The descent was from the north, as specified in the original transmission, still logged in the mission file 3 months later. Nobody went near the eastern sector. The clearing looked, to most of the team, like any forest clearing on an oxygen-rich planet. Wide, green-floored, bordered by enormous trees. To Rail it looked like the pod site, minus the pod, which had been retrieved in a separate mission. The scar where it had come down was still visible in the ground cover, a rough oval of disturbed soil that was already being colonized by the low, spreading plants that grew along the forest floor. Dr. Vaughn was cataloging within 90 seconds of stepping off the ramp. She moved fast and in multiple directions at once, scanning, tagging, noting, with an energy that made the rest of the team look slightly tired by comparison. The other crew members set about establishing base camp with practiced efficiency. Rail unloaded his kit and walked to the south edge of the clearing and looked at the trees. The big one was still there. He could see the platform from the ground, a dark shape in the branch junction, partially obscured by new leaf growth, but structurally unchanged. The pulley cable was still in place, hanging in a loose arc from the upper branch. He had not been sure it would survive 3 months of weather. He went back to camp. The first day was set up. The second day was when Brick arrived. He came out of the tree line mid-morning, from the northeast, from the direction of the platform tree. He moved without particular hurry, covering the open ground of the clearing with a steady, unhurried pace, and his size was the first thing anyone noticed, because he was larger than the transmission footage had suggested, and the 3 months since had added more. He was not a small animal any longer. His chest came to Rail's shoulder when he sat. His paws, the broad back 4, left clear depressions in the soft ground as he walked. The charcoal and cream fur was denser than Rail remembered, the outer coat longer, and the iridescent quality of it was stronger in the daylight. The guard hairs caught the morning sun and threw back colors that did not quite match the input light, blue-black and deep green moving across the surface as he moved. His spine lights, running in slow amber, were wider and brighter than they had been. The survey team had been in the process of running a soil scan on the east side of camp. They were not doing that anymore. They were standing very still and watching the large creature walk toward Rail with the focused attention of people trying to determine whether they needed to do something urgent. Brick walked directly to Rail and sat down in front of him. He looked at Rail. Rail looked at him. Then Brick headbutted him. It was a full, direct, unhesitating headbutt, forehead to chest, the full weight of his considerable mass behind it, delivered without malice and without warning. Rail went back 2 full steps. Someone in the survey team made a sound. Rail caught his balance, steadied himself, and then he laughed. It was a real laugh, the kind that comes out before a person decides whether to let it, and it sat on his face while he reached up and found the ridge behind Brick's left ear where the fur parted along the spine light channel. He pressed his fingers against it and scratched, slowly, following the line. Brick's back legs gave way. Not fell, gave way, in the controlled manner of something choosing to lie down quickly because remaining upright had become a lower priority. He sank to the forest floor and sprawled there with his front paws outstretched and his wide head dropping toward Rail's feet, and he made the low subsonic sound that was more felt than heard, the rumble that Rail had first described in his personal log as like standing next to a very happy engine. The spine lights went immediately, deeply, completely blue. The survey team let out a collective breath. Dr. Vaughn had not breathed out. She was recording on 3 separate devices. Over the days that followed, Brick established his presence in the camp in the way that felt, in retrospect, like it had always been the plan. He was not interested in the scientific equipment, except to investigate it once per device, applying his structural testing methodology to each new item. Sitting on the cases, pressing the front paws against the sensor housings, applying weight to the portable shelter frames. Anything that held took no further interest. Anything that wobbled got a second, more thorough test. The portable shelter frames were reinforced after the first day, not because Brick had damaged them, but because the testing had revealed that they were less solid than they should be. He was very interested in Rail's food. He was also interested in Dr. Vaughn's 4 upper limbs, which he found deeply fascinating and spent considerable time investigating with his nose and, occasionally, with his own front paws, apparently comparing the arrangements. Vaughn allowed this with the barely contained professional excitement of someone who is having the most interesting experience of her career and is trying very hard to observe rather than react. On the 4th day, 2 adult predators came into the northern treeline. Rail heard them first, the low, resonant call that he had heard from the safety of the platform on his first night, closer now, and accompanied by a second, slightly different one. He was on the platform, running checks on the structure's 3-month condition, and he stopped what he was doing and looked toward the sound. Below, in the camp clearing, Brick had also stopped. He was on his feet, facing north, and his spine lights had gone from blue to a rapid, sharp amber. The pulse Rail had seen only once before, briefly, when something large had moved through the forest close to the platform on the 2nd night. The predators stayed in the treeline. Rail could not see them clearly, large shapes, dark, moving in the shadow of the lower canopy. He could see enough to understand that they were bigger than Brick, meaningfully bigger, the kind of size that explained why the ground-level sounds on his first night had seemed so large. Brick walked toward the treeline. He did not move fast. He moved with a deliberate, measured pace, and his spine lights when he walked were doing something Rail had not seen before. Not the rapid, anxious pulse, not the steady, calm blue, but a wide, slow, rhythmic flare that pulsed from dim to bright and back, a pattern that was visible even in the daylight, and that carried the specific quality of something meant to be seen. He stopped at the treeline edge and stood there. The large shapes in the shadows went still. Brick's spine lights flared once, a single, sharp, full brightness pulse that bleached the surrounding air white for a half-second. Then he barked. One short, powerful sound that moved through the camp and through Rail's chest at the same time, a sound that had no room in it for ambiguity about what it meant. The large shapes in the treeline moved away, not fast, but away, and continuing away, and the sound of them retreating faded into the forest. Brick turned around and walked back to camp. He went to Rail's supply crate, which was his current preferred resting spot, sat on it, and looked at nobody in particular with an expression of complete neutrality. His spine lights ran slow and gold. The supply crate held his weight without incident. He had tested it on day 2. That evening, Dr. Vaughn sat with Rail and spread her notes across the camp table and talked for 2 hours. She had initial species classification, preliminary, subject to formal review, but solid enough for a working framework. The species was deeply social with long memory. Their bonding behaviors were foundational. Once a bond was formed, it was territorial in both directions, meaning the bonded individual was adopted into the territory and the territory was extended to include them. The spine light system was a full communicative and emotional display, far more complex than surface reading suggested. The front limb dexterity indicated a cognitive architecture capable of tool interaction. And the bonding itself, the mechanism, the specific circumstances under which it occurred. The rescue behavior, Vaughn said, freeing a trapped individual. In their behavioral framework, this is not a neutral act. It is a foundational bonding trigger. It does not require shared species. It requires a specific sequence, recognition of trapped state, deliberate approach, physical intervention, successful release. Rail looked at his notes. So when I freed him from the vine growth, you completed the bonding sequence. From his perspective, you did not help a trapped animal. You performed the act that initiates lifelong territorial bonding. Vaughn made a note on her pad. He did not follow you back to the crash site because he was grateful. He followed you because you were part of his territory now. Rail was quiet for a moment. He looked across the camp at Brick, who was sprawled at the far edge of the firelight with his enormous head resting on his front paws, spine lights running slow and dim and blue in the dark. He kept bringing me fruit I hadn't asked for, Rail said. I thought he was just leaving it around. Care feeding. It is a core bonding behavior. He was providing for you. You were in his territory, and he was making sure you had resources. Rail thought about this for a while. He was doing this better than I was, he said. You built him a house, Vaughn said. I built me a house. He just moved into it. From his perspective, Vaughn said, with the precision of someone who had thought about this, that is the same thing. The last evening of the survey mission's first week, the team was inside. Someone had cooked a communal meal, and the camp was warm, and the conversation was loose in the way it gets when people have worked together for several days in an interesting place and are not yet tired of each other. Rail went up to the platform. He had reinforced it during the survey, added proper railings, corrected the north side list, upgraded the pulley with a component from the shuttle's supply kit. The rainwater collector was still running, the angle still 7 degrees. The sleeping section was there, and the storage shelf, and the view from the western edge was the same view he had pointed a camera at 3 months ago, the canopy stretching out below in the late light, the gap in the trees showing the sky. Brick came up behind him. He climbed the tree the same way he always had, back legs gripping the bark, front limbs reaching, and he was faster at it now, more confident with his larger weight, and he arrived at the platform with an expression of complete normality and immediately laid down across the majority of the floor space. His tail found Rail's lap without apparent intention. His spine lights were dim and blue and even in the coming dark. Rail sat there for a while. He had his personal log with him, force of habit, but he did not write in it. He just sat with the weight of Brick's tail across his legs and the warmth that came off the dense fur and the sound of the forest settling into its night version. Then he opened his transmission kit and sent a message to Dova Shun at Fleet Station Caro. Short, no formal header, not a report. Brick says hello. He's bigger. He closed the kit and stayed where he was. At Fleet Station Caro, Dova read the message. She read it again, once, then forwarded it to Pell's channel without a comment because no comment was needed. Pell read it. He set down the navigation report he had been working on. He looked at the message for a moment with the expression of a 31-year veteran of deep space work encountering something that was not in any of his operational frameworks and had not been since the first time either. He typed one word and sent it back. Obviously. On the platform 60 meters above the forest floor of a planet with no name on any chart, Rail Dunn read the reply and smiled. The same small, involuntary kind from the clearing, the kind that happens before a person has time to decide about it. Below the canopy, the night sounds of DF9 began their familiar, resonant chorus. Above it, through the western gap in the trees, the first stars of the planet's sky were coming out. Unfamiliar stars, not in any map he had grown up with, burning steady and cold in the dark between the worlds. Brick rumbled. Deep, even, subsonic, felt in the chest rather than heard with the ears. Rail leaned back against the trunk of the biggest tree in the forest and listened to the planet breathe. He was, if anyone had asked, which nobody did, because the night was quiet and there was nobody to ask, entirely fine. He had always been entirely fine. That was, in the end, the thing that nobody could quite put into words, but everyone who had read the file or seen the transmission or heard the story already understood. Not that a human cadet had survived on an uncharted world, because survival was the baseline, and the baseline was not the story. The story was the pulley. The story was 7 degrees. The story was a boy in an alien forest who had looked at disaster and seen a project, and had seen a trapped animal and seen a friend, and had spent 2 days building something that worked before he ever asked to be found. The stars came out over DF9. Brick's spine lights glowed dim and blue and steady in the dark, a small private constellation in the canopy of a world without a name. And Rail done, Cadet did not need to be anywhere else.